My name is Kirsten Romero. I am 42 years old, and for the last 19 years, I've worked as a charge nurse in the intensive care unit at St. Jude's in Nashville. You get used to the rhythm of a hospital, the rhythmic hiss of the ventilators, the sterile, biting smell of floor wax and heparin, and the way the air feels heavy, almost humid, right before a code blue is called. But on Tuesday, January 13, 2026, the air didn't just feel heavy, it felt static. It was one of those shifts where every monitor seemed to be chirping out of sync, a discordant symphony of electronic anxiety that set my teeth on edge. I remember checking the chart for a post-op patient in room 402, feeling a sudden, sharp pressure behind my left eye. It wasn't a headache, it was a physical displacement, like someone had shoved a cold needle into my temple. I leaned against the nurse's station, my hand gripping the cold laminate edge. My coworker, Marcus, looked up from his clipboard, his brow furrowing as he caught my eye. He asked if I was okay, but his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well, distorted and slow. I tried to answer, to tell him I just needed a minute to breathe, but the floor suddenly tilted 45 degrees to the right. The linoleum tiles, scuffed by 1,000 frantic footsteps, rushed up to meet me. I felt the impact of my shoulder hitting the ground, but there was no pain, only a profound, terrifying coldness spreading from my chest to my fingertips. This wasn't a feint, this was a total system failure. I heard the code blue called over the intercom, the mechanical voice echoing through the hallway, and for a split second, I had the absurd thought that they were calling it for someone else. Then, the darkness didn't just fall, it crushed me. The clinical reality of dying is much noisier than the movies suggest. I could hear the shears cutting through my blue scrub top, the ones I'd just ironed that morning, the frantic snap of latex gloves, and the rhythmic, brutal thud of chest compressions. My own team, people I'd grabbed coffee with in the break room, were breaking my ribs to keep me here. I wanted to tell them to stop, not because I wanted to die, but because the effort felt so small compared to the silence I was drifting into. The monitor's flatline was a solid, unrelenting tone that seemed to vibrate in my very marrow. I watched from a corner of the ceiling, detached and analytical, noting the exact dosage of epinephrine Marcus was drawing up with trembling hands. I saw my own face, pale and slack, and realized with a jarring lack of emotion that the woman in those scrubs was no longer me. The transition wasn't a tunnel or a bright light. It was more like walking out of a crowded, screaming room into a soundproofed gallery. One moment I was hovering over my own body in the ICU, smelling the burnt toast scent of the defibrillator pads, and the next, I was standing in a place that felt more solid than the world I'd left behind. It looked like the hallway of the hospital, but the walls were made of something that resembled frosted glass, pulsing with a low, rhythmic amber glow. The chaos was gone. There was no more screaming, no more frantic footsteps of the crash team. There was only a profound, terrifying stillness. I looked down at my hands. They weren't glowing or translucent. They looked exactly as they had, the same small scar on my thumb from a kitchen knife, the same wedding band, but the weight of my own history felt stripped away. I started walking because standing still felt like I was tempting the void to take me back. The floor beneath me didn't click under my clogs, it felt like walking on pressurized air. As I moved, the glass walls began to show flickers of things that weren't hospital rooms. I saw a grocery store 3 blocks from my house, the shelves strangely empty, a single mother staring at a price tag with a look of such concentrated despair that it felt like a physical blow to my chest. I saw a bank lobby in downtown Nashville where the digital tickers on the wall were frozen, and the people inside weren't moving, just staring at their phones with expressions of muted horror. It wasn't a vision of the end of the world. It was a vision of a world that had simply stopped working. Then, he was there. He wasn't floating, and he didn't have a halo. He was just standing by a window that looked out onto a version of Nashville I didn't recognize, a city draped in a strange, pre-storm twilight. He was wearing a simple, dark tunic, his back to me, looking out at the skyline. The presence he radiated wasn't peace, in the way people describe it, it was gravity. It was the feeling that he was the only fixed point in a universe that had suddenly come untethered. When he turned, I didn't see a stranger. I saw someone who had been standing next to me during every difficult intubation, every grieving family meeting, every lonely drive home at 4 a.m. He didn't smile. His face was etched with a sorrow so deep it made my heart ache. "Kirsten," he said, and his voice wasn't a sound, it was a memory being woken up. "You're looking at the wrong things. You're looking at the shadows. I need you to see the shift." He pointed toward the window, toward a date that felt heavy in the air, and the room turned ice cold. Standing there in that glass-walled version of Nashville, I felt a vibration that wasn't sound. It was a frequency of pure dread. Jesus didn't look like a painting. He looked like a man who had seen every tragedy of the last 2,000 years and was now watching the final domino begin its slow, inevitable tilt. He gestured toward the horizon where the Nashville skyline usually sat. In its place was a shifting, digital-like haze, a distortion in the fabric of the air itself. "March is the hinge, Kirsten," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a gavel strike. "The world believes it is waiting for recovery, but what starts in March is the great sifting. It is the moment the systems of man finally admit they can no longer hold the weight of their own lies." I looked out and saw a vision of a local bank, the one on West End where I keep my meager savings. It wasn't on fire. There were no looters. It was worse. It was silent. A line of people stood at the glass doors, their faces illuminated by the blue light of their phones. I saw a middle-aged man in a business suit, his tie loosened, weeping quietly as he stared at a "System Offline" sign taped to the door. "The wealth of the world is being digitized into a cage," Jesus whispered, and as he spoke, I felt a coldness creep into my bones. He showed me the hospital where I worked, but the pharmacy was locked behind iron grates. The supply chains hadn't just slowed down, they had snapped. I saw my own co-workers, people like Marcus, staring at empty shelves where the IV bags should be. The shift wasn't a physical war, it was an invisible withdrawal of the resources we all took for granted. "Why March?" I asked, my voice trembling. I thought of my daughter's tuition, my mortgage, the simple reality of buying milk. He turned his gaze toward me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something like warning in his eyes. "Because the heart of the world has grown cold to the neighbor, so the world will now grow cold to the heart." In March, the digital curtain falls. It begins with the banks, but it ends with the soul. Those who have built their houses on the sand of a screen will find they have no floor to stand on. He wasn't talking about a prophecy in a book, he was talking about the grocery store down the street. He was talking about the way we've traded our humanity for a convenience that was about to be revoked. The vision shifted from the wide skyline to a more intimate, agonizing detail. I was standing in the middle of a Sunday service, not at my own church, but a large, modern one with stadium seating and high-end lighting. The atmosphere was electric, but it wasn't the Holy Spirit, it was panic. The pastor was on stage, but he wasn't preaching. He was on his phone, his face pale, frantically scrolling as the congregation began to murmur. The March event had hit during the service. I saw a woman in the third row grab her husband's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. She was showing him a text message. I couldn't see the words, but I could see the reflection of a red X on her screen. "Access denied." Jesus stood beside me in the aisle of this frantic church. "They built monuments to me while ignoring the broken at their gates," he said, his voice devoid of anger but filled with a terrifying clarity. "In March, the institutions will try to save themselves first. They will tell you it is for the common good, but it is for the preservation of the tower." I watched as the ushers began to close the sanctuary doors, not to keep the peace, but to keep people out. The social contract was shredding in real time. I saw a man I recognized, a local politician who often spoke about values, quietly slipping out a side exit, his security detail pushing a homeless man out of the way to clear a path to a waiting black SUV. The tension in the room was a physical weight. People weren't looking at the cross, they were looking at their bank apps. They were looking at the news alerts that were flashing "emergency protocol" in bold, jagged letters. "What changes in March is the illusion of safety," Jesus said, stepping closer to the weeping woman in the third row. He didn't touch her, but he stood over her with a fierce, protective sorrow. "The safety you bought with your silence is being taken back. In March, the world becomes a place of restricted access. If you do not have the mark of their system, you will not have the bread of their table. But I am the bread. And many have forgotten how to eat." I felt a personal fracture then. A realization that my own life, my own comfortable suburban existence, was built on the same brittle glass as this church. The scene in the church dissolved, and suddenly, I wasn't a spectator anymore. I was standing in my own kitchen in Nashville. The light coming through the window had that sickly, bruised purple hue of a storm that refused to break. I saw my husband, David, sitting at the small breakfast nook where we usually drink our coffee and complain about the hospital scheduling. But he wasn't drinking coffee. He was staring at his laptop, his face illuminated by the cold, flickering light of the screen. I watched him try to log into our joint savings account, his fingers trembling so badly he kept hitting the wrong keys. On the third attempt, the screen didn't show our balance. It flashed a gray dialog box that read, Account restricted, compliance review required. David, I whispered, but I was a ghost in my own home. He couldn't hear me. He let out a ragged, choked sound, a sob that he tried to swallow, and put his head in his hands. I saw the mail on the counter. A stack of notices with "Final Action" stamped in red. This was the personal cost of the March event Jesus was describing. It wasn't just a global headline, it was the quiet, suffocating death of a middle-class life. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but my hand passed through him like smoke. I felt the agonizing sting of every time I'd prioritized an extra shift over a family dinner, every time we'd put our security in a number on a screen rather than in the people around us. Our lives were being erased by a line of code, and we were completely powerless to stop it. Jesus stood by the refrigerator, looking at the photos we'd pinned there, vacations, graduation shots, a drawing our niece made. "The fracture starts at the hearth, Kirsten," he said, his voice echoing in the small space. "In March, the pressure will be applied to the things you love most. They will offer you a way out, a way to restore this comfort, but it will come at the cost of your confession." I looked at David, who was now frantically checking his phone, only to find the signal bars dropping to 0. The isolation was beginning. The system wasn't just failing, it was being intentionally withdrawn to see who would break. I realized then that my return wouldn't be to a world of recovery, but to a world where I would have to choose between my survival and my soul. The kitchen walls began to stretch and warp, the familiar cabinets melting away until I was standing once again on that high, glass-like precipice with him. The Nashville skyline below was now a grid of darkness, with only the occasional strobe of emergency lights cutting through the gloom. I turned to him, my heart hammering against a chest that no longer felt like it belonged to me. "You have to tell me," I demanded, the nurse in me needing a clear diagnosis, a timeline. "What starts in March? Why did the title of this warning say you revealed it? What is actually happening to us?" He didn't turn away. He looked directly into me, and the intensity of his gaze was almost more than I could bear. "In March," he began, "the transition to the new order is finalized. It is not a suggestion, it is a mandate. The digital currency you saw failing is being replaced by a ledger of obedience. What starts in March is the validation period. For 3 months, every soul will be tracked by their utility to the state. If you are a healer who will not conform to the new protocols, your access to the world is severed. If you are a teacher who will not speak the sanctioned truth, your voice is silenced by the removal of your means to live." I felt the weight of his words like lead. "Who is affected?" I asked. "Everyone?" He nodded slowly. "Everyone who relies on the machine to breathe. The outcome is determined by one thing: where your hunger lies. If you hunger for the bread of the system, you will become a slave to the system. If you hunger for the truth, you will walk through a fire, but the fire will not consume you." March is the month the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, not by their words, but by their dependencies. He showed me a vision of a crowded city square where a kiosk was being set up. People were lining up, not for food, but to have their eyes scanned, to have their digital identities verified so they could buy a single loaf of bread. I saw a man I recognized, a doctor from my hospital, standing in that line, his face a mask of shame. The shift was here, and it was a choice that couldn't be undone. The glass precipice dissolved, and I was pulled back into a scene that felt more like a memory of the future than a dream. I was standing in my daughter's bedroom. She's 19, away at college in East Tennessee, but in this vision, she was home, sitting on the edge of her bed with her head between her knees. The room was dark, save for the blue light of her tablet. I saw her trying to buy a bus ticket back to school, her thumb tapping the screen with an increasing, frantic speed. Every time she hit confirm, a red banner appeared at the top of the screen: travel authorization denied. Social health score insufficient. Jesus stood in the corner of her room, his presence overshadowing the posters on her wall. "The warning isn't for the world at large, Kirsten," he said softly. "It is for the parents. It is for the ones who will be asked to sacrifice their children's future to maintain their own peace." I watched my daughter look up, her eyes red and rimmed with a terrifying kind of exhaustion. She looked at her phone, then at a small device on her nightstand, a new government-issued terminal that everyone had been told to install by the end of February. All she had to do was press a button to verify compliance, and her travel would be restored. Her tuition would be paid. Her life would return to normal. The pressure in the room was suffocating. I wanted to scream at her not to touch it, to tell her that the compliance they were asking for was a slow-acting poison for her soul. But I was silent. I saw the moment her resolve broke. I saw her hand shake as it moved toward the terminal. This is the personal fracture, Jesus whispered. In March, the test will not be a grand gesture of martyrdom. It will be the quiet, desperate need to see your children fed and educated. The system will use your love as a weapon against your faith. I felt a physical pain in my chest, a tearing sensation that made me realize I wasn't just watching her, I was watching the failure of my own legacy. I had raised her to be successful in a world that was now demanding she vow to stay that way. The scene shifted one last time before the descent back to my body. I was standing in a courtroom, but there was no judge and no jury. There were only rows of desks manned by people in headsets, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of data streams. This was the administrative heart of what was coming in March. It was sterile, efficient, and completely devoid of human empathy. I saw a name flash on a screen, my name. Underneath it, a list of non-compliant behaviors began to scroll. Religious affiliation, high risk. Medical refusal history, documented. Social influence, moderate. Jesus stood at the center of the room, and for the first time, he looked truly formidable. He wasn't the meek and mild savior of the Sunday school stories. He was the King of Kings, and his presence made the high-tech equipment in the room seem like toys. The world thinks March is about a new policy, he said, his voice echoing through the sterile hall. But I am using their own greed to sift them. I am allowing the systems of man to become so restrictive that only those who truly know my voice will be able to stand. Those who have used my name for profit will be the first to fall in line with the new ledger. Those who have sought me in the secret place will find that I have already prepared a table for them in the wilderness. I looked at the screens and saw thousands of names being flagged, moved into restricted folders. I saw families being separated by digital borders, their assets frozen because they refused to sign a document that equated the state with God. What changes in March is the end of the middle ground, Jesus said, turning to face me fully. The gray area is being removed. You will either be a part of the machine, or you will be a part of the remnant. There is no longer a way to be both. He stepped toward me, and the glass walls of the vision began to crack. The sound was like 1,000 windows breaking at once. You must go back, Kirsten. You must tell them that the recovery is a trap. The only safety is in the surrender of the life they are trying to save. The sound of the cracking glass intensified until it wasn't a sound anymore, but a physical vibration that shook my very soul. The majestic, terrifying clarity of the glass-walled Nashville began to blur, replaced by a sudden, violent rushing sensation. It felt like being pulled backward through a narrow straw at 1,000 miles per hour. The transition wasn't peaceful, it was a brutal, bone-shaking re-entry into a body that felt like it had been through a car wreck. I heard the sharp, high-pitched beep-beep-beep of a cardiac monitor, not the flatline this time, but the frantic, irregular rhythm of a heart trying to remember how to beat. The first thing I felt was the cold. It was an invasive, clinical cold that seemed to originate from the center of my bones. Then came the pain, the searing, localized agony of my sternum where they had performed compressions. I gasped, a ragged, wet sound that felt like swallowing glass. Above me, the ICU lights were blinding, a harsh and unforgiving white that made me squeeze my eyes shut. I heard Marcus's voice, but it wasn't distorted anymore. It was sharp with adrenaline and disbelief. We got a rhythm. She's back. Kirsten, stay with me. Kirsten. I felt his hand on my shoulder, the weight of a living human being. But all I could think about was the man in the dark tunic and the system offline sign I had seen on the bank door. I tried to speak, to tell them about March, but my throat was raw from the intubation tube they were already starting to pull. I could only manage a weak, trembling grip on Marcus's sleeve. He leaned in, his face pale and slick with sweat. You were gone for 6 minutes, Kirsten, he whispered, his voice shaking. 6 minutes of pure flatline. I looked at the clock on the wall, the same one from my vision. It was 2:21 p.m. The world looked exactly the same as it had when I collapsed, but the weight of the shift was sitting on my chest like a lead weight. I realized with a sickening jolt that I hadn't just seen a vision, I had been given a map of a house that was already on fire. Recovery in the hospital where you work is its own kind of hell. You know too much about the sounds behind the curtain. For 3 days, I lay in a bed on the 3rd floor, watching the news on the small, wall-mounted TV. On the surface, the world was still spinning. The pundits were talking about a slight market correction and a new digital security initiative being rolled out in the coming weeks. They used soft, comforting words like integration and streamlining. But every time I saw the word March on the scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen, my stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. On the fourth day, I was sitting up, trying to eat some lukewarm broth, when Marcus came by on his break. He looked different, older, somehow, with dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there on Tuesday. He sat in the plastic chair by my bed and didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at the TV. "Something's happening at the bank, Kirsten," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. He pulled out his phone and showed me an email from the hospital administration. It was a notice that our next payroll would be delayed by 48 hours due to a mandatory system upgrade involving the new federal digital ledger. "They're saying it's just a glitch," Marcus said, rubbing his face with his hands. "But I tried to use my debit card at the gas station this morning, and it was declined. Not because I didn't have money, but because the terminal said, incompatible credentials." He looked at me, and I saw the same muted horror I had seen in the eyes of the people in the bank lobby in my vision. The validation period Jesus had mentioned wasn't starting in March, the foundations were being laid in January. I reached out and took his hand, my heart hammering. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady for the first time since I woke up. "Don't trust the upgrade. Whatever they ask you to sign to get your money back, don't just sign it." He looked at me like I was crazy, but I saw the seed of doubt take root in his eyes. By the time I was discharged and back in my own house, the atmosphere of the country had shifted from uneasy to unrecognizable. It was early February, and the glitches Marcus and I had discussed were no longer anomalies, they were a coordinated silence. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had seen David weeping in my vision, and tried to log into my hospital employee portal to check my benefits. The screen didn't load. Instead, a prompt appeared, asking for a unified digital signature, tied to a new government-backed health verification app. My pulse quickened. This was the digital curtain Jesus had described. Then, the irreversible event happened, the moment that proved my vision wasn't a product of oxygen deprivation. I received a certified letter from the Tennessee Department of Health. It wasn't a general notice, it was addressed to me, Kirsten Romero, RN. It stated that as of March 1st, all licensed medical professionals were required to enroll in the National Service and Compliance Registry. Enrollment required a biometric scan and the signing of a Universal Ethics Agreement, which explicitly forbade the sharing of unauthorized spiritual or medical misinformation. If I didn't comply by March 15th, my nursing license, the career I had spent 20 years building, would be permanently revoked. Not suspended, deleted. I walked into the living room and found David staring at the TV. The news was showing a live feed from Washington. They were announcing the March 1st initiative, a temporary suspension of physical currency to combat the ongoing digital instability. The announcer was smiling, talking about how this would protect the elderly from fraud, but I saw the ticker at the bottom. Enrollment in the Unified Ledger grants immediate access to basic necessities. I looked at the letter in my hand and then at the TV. This was the sifting. My livelihood was being held hostage in exchange for my silence. I realized with a terrifying clarity that I could no longer be a nurse and a follower of the truth at the same time. The middle ground had evaporated just as he said it would. It is now the last week of February. The air in Nashville is cold, a biting, damp wind that rattles the window panes of our house. I spent the morning in the garden, looking at the dead stalks of the hydrangeas, wondering if I will even be here to see them bloom in the spring. The hospital has called me 3 times this week, asking when I'm coming in to complete my paperwork. Each time, I've let it go to voicemail. Marcus texted me yesterday. He signed. He told me he had to. He has 3 kids and a mortgage. He sounded like a different person on the phone, his voice flat and drained of the light I used to see in the ICU. He told me it wasn't a big deal, just a digital handshake, but I could hear the lie vibrating in his throat. I'm sitting here now, looking at the photo pinned to my fridge, the one Jesus stood next to in my vision. My daughter called me last night, crying because her university is requiring the same unified signature for her to stay in her dorm past the March 15th deadline. She asked me what she should do. I wanted to tell her to just sign it, to stay safe, to keep her future. But I remembered the sorrow in his eyes when he looked at the woman in the church. I told her to wait. I told her we were going to have to find another way, even if that way meant losing everything we thought we owned. The shift isn't a headline anymore, it's the silence in my house as we prepare to disconnect from a world that demands our worship. I haven't gone back to work. My bank account shows a balance I can no longer withdraw. This morning, for the first time, our grocery delivery was canceled because my compliance status was listed as pending. It's a small thing, just a bag of groceries, but it's the first ripple of the tide that's coming in March. I went to the window and looked out at the street. A black SUV I didn't recognize was parked 2 houses down, the driver just sitting there, looking at a tablet. I don't feel the peace the movies talk about. I feel a heavy, grounded fear, but underneath it, a strange, immovable rock. I picked up my Bible and felt the worn leather of the cover. It's the only thing I have left that doesn't require a login. The sun is setting over the Nashville skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the yard.
If this message felt important, it probably was. There are more stories like this, and they only get deeper. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one, because some warnings aren't meant to be ignored.